I'm mindful that within and without the buildings and land that we're in, that this land was and always will be Aboriginal land. With those words, I welcome you. My name is David Heilpern. I'm an adjunct professor and practice professor at Southern Cross University. Until fairly recently, I was a magistrate on the local court in New South Wales for 21 years. And since then, I've been active in the sphere of drive change, trying to change our drug driving laws to reflect some common sense. We thought we'd start by a little video that was made, a cartoon animated video that was made as a result of a speech that I was giving in Nimbin some time ago. So let's have a look at that just to kick off the discussion. Margaret lives in a tiny hamlet west of Lismore that we'll call Tabulum. Margaret is a single mum of 2 high school aged children, and like everyone else, she needs her licence to work. She suffers from chronic pain. Some of the medications that she had been on led to sleepiness, led to tiredness, led to lack of concentration, and led to her not enjoying her life with a lot of side effects. She'd previously been under a mental health plan and sought counselling and therapy, but 12 months ago was prescribed cannabis as a medicine, and her life changed. Even though it was costing her $260 per month, she describes the cannabis drops as worth every cent. She sleeps a solid 6 hours per night. Her chronic pain and insomnia is completely in hand, and there are no noticeable side effects. When she can not quite afford the $260 a month, she lowers her use, and she knows that by lowering that use, many of the symptoms come back. On the 1st of August 2020, Margaret was driving to work when she was pulled over by the local police, and she tested positive to THC. She lost her licence for 3 months. As a result, she just lost her job cleaning at the local club. The reason she lost her job is because it was a drug-related offence and it was against the club's policy. She could have taken it to court and fought the 3-month suspension, but there was no legal aid for that, and she was told her chances were not great before that particular magistrate. So she's lost her job. She's now on welfare with a work test, finding it very hard to pay the rent each month. She can't afford medicinal cannabis at all and is back on the prescription drugs that don't work, that have side effects, that make her tired, and eventually she hopes to get her licence back. What are the lessons from Margaret's story? These laws are insane. They are just crazy. There was no impairment by Margaret. She was no danger to anyone, and yet that is a true story of someone who these drug driving laws affect. And that's what we need to change. People who use cannabis as a medicine should never drive while they're under the influence and weaving all over the road and a danger to the community. That's not what this is about. That's not what these laws are about. They're about stopping the state from taking away people's licences who are no risk to anyone in the community. The panel we have here tonight is me, Fiona Patten, Dr. Teresa Towpik, Dr. Thomas Arkell, and by the magic of technology, a cut-out cardboard version, a video version of Mick Palmer, who unfortunately couldn't make it at the last moment. Fiona has been a member of the Victorian Legislative Council for the Northern Metropolitan Region since 2014. She's the leader of Reason Party, described as a future-focused, evidence-based movement committed to delivering equality, sustainability and freedom through new methods of political engagement and pragmatic consultation. In October 2020, after a few years of fighting for equal driving rights, Fiona's proposal to change driving laws for patients began to weave its way through Victorian Parliament. Dr. Teresa Towpik, originally from Poland, has been a doctor since 1991 and became interested in medicinal cannabis in 2016. She co-founded MediHuanna, an organisation devoted to delivery of science-based and college-accredited medicinal cannabis education for healthcare professionals. In 2019, she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, and to date has been using medicinal cannabis in conjunction with conventional treatments. Dr. Thomas Arkell, you can wave, Thomas, is a psychopharmacologist with a background in psychology and philosophy. He has a fascination with all things cannabis and a broad interest in how psychoactive drugs affect human behaviour and cognition and our experience of the world around us. Dr. Arkell's work to date has focused primarily on cannabis and its effects on driving and cognition. He holds a PhD in medicine from the University of Sydney and currently works at Swinburne University in Melbourne. Mick Palmer, who's not here, is a barrister and 33-year career police officer with extensive experience in police leadership and reform in community, national and international policing. In 1994, he was the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police and also the inaugural Deputy Chair of the National Council Against Drugs, a position he occupied until retirement in 2001. He's an ambassador of Drive Change, a spokesperson for the Ted Noss Foundation Take Control campaign for safer and saner drug laws. And he's a director and a director. So just by way of introduction, I'll just do a snapshot of where we're at now. At the moment in Australia, this year, there will be just over 500,000 drug driving tests. That is where police pull people over and test them by way of swab for drugs. Of those 500,000, there will be a strike rate, as the police call it, of 8%, which is 40,000 people. Those 40,000 people, almost all bar 500 or 600, will lose their licence. That means that they will have either a traffic or criminal record, whichever way you look at it. They will not be able to drive. The minimum is for 3 months. And as a result of that, most of them will stop taking their medicinal cannabis if that indeed was the source. There's no actual statistics of how many of that 40,000 were medicinal cannabis patients in the sense of using cannabis that is prescribed. My bet is just over half. It could be more, it could be less. But nevertheless, there is a significant problem. What is the price of this? Well, the price of this for those people is, as we saw in the cartoon, the animation is extremely high. They lose their license, they can lose their jobs, they can not be able to pay their mortgage, and of course they lose the right to take a medication that a doctor has prescribed them. What is the impact of taking away all these people's licenses on the road toll in terms of death and road trauma? Well, the answer is, well, we don't know for sure, but there is no evidence of any reduction in the road toll. When they introduced random breath testing, when they introduced seatbelts, when they introduced airbags, lower speed limits, you could see the change in death and road trauma. There has been no such change evidenced in Australia as a result of these laws. And we actually can test this really clearly because in Tasmania, there is a defence to a charge of drug driving if you were taking according to your prescription. And guess what? The sky has not fallen in. There is not a greater number of deaths in Tasmania as a result. And there has not been a single coronial finding that there has been any deaths caused by medicinal cannabis, not one. The big lie in this debate that we all have to confront is the number of researchers, road safety experts, police officers, some politicians who say that prescription cannabis medicine causes deaths on our road. This is a big lie. There is just no evidence of causation. There's not one case. There's not, and the language is very couched. Normally they say cannabis is involved in 15%, for example, of all road deaths. And that's just because there may be a level of detection in coronial numbers of people who are driving. But as I say, how many of those are medicinal cannabis users? We don't know. But we do know that in Tasmania, the sky's not fallen in. There's no difference with the rest of Australia, and yet they provide protection for those who are prescribed cannabis. So that is my little snapshot. We have some developments in Victoria, some in South Australia. We have an upper house inquiry going to commence shortly in New South Wales. But I was naive enough to believe when I left the bench and got involved with Drive Change that we would see change. It was just such a minuscule little low-hanging fruit change in the big scheme of the world to enable this equality for those who are choosing cannabis as their medicine as opposed to any other prescription drug. But alas, I was wrong. And we've not seen any change in any of the states. Tasmania was already changed, where we've been active and lobbying throughout Australia. Of course, that's not to say that there's not good, honest politicians struggling to assist in creating that change. Of course, there has been, and people like Fiona have been at the forefront of that. But that's where we're at now. And I think it's probably time that we hear a 5-minute snapshot of where we're at and the kind of work that people are doing from each of our panellists before we start some questions. I think we might start with Teresa. Teresa, can you give us a 5-minute snapshot of where you're at in this space?
Thank you very much, David. So I've been involved in medicinal cannabis space since 2016 and changed my views from being quite ignorant, I would say very ignorant before that day, and become passionate advocate. I was one of the first doctors, prescribing doctors in Australia, and I prescribed medicinal cannabis to many patients and feel very privileged to observe multiple beneficial effects. And I'm a fan of MediHuanna, and through MediHuanna, we are teaching many doctors around Australia how to prescribe medicinal cannabis judiciously, responsibly, in a proper clinical setting. We've trained over 1,000 doctors so far, so we're prescribing as well. And with regards to my patients, I've seen many beneficial effects, but what is also very interesting, many of them said to me, oh, by the way, my driving is so much better now while on cannabis. I feel better, I sleep better, I am not in so much pain. And first of all, I'm more alert. And many patients actually said to me, my brain fog has lifted and I'm more responsible as a driver. So as a doctor, you are supposed to give them advice. They are not allowed to drive one on any form of any amount of THC. They're coming to you and said, actually, I'm much better because when I was on this long list of opioids, benzos, antidepressants, anticonvulsants, I actually felt like a zombie. I sometimes didn't know how I happened to come from A to B, and then I wasn't stopped. So this is a very significant problem for prescribing doctors. I'm also a medicinal cannabis patient myself, and it's been 3 years since I was diagnosed, and 90% of women in my condition generally pass away within 3 years period. And I don't want to jinx it, but I'm doing very well. I'm healing, the lesions are resolving. And I think it is partially due to cannabis in combination with conventional drugs. And I actually experienced that feeling when I was stopped last year on the way to Nimbin, when police stopped me. I just happened not to have cannabis for a couple of nights, but I really felt that feeling of anxiety and just all of these thoughts were racing through my mind. If I am tested positive now, what is going to happen to my reputation? How am I going to function? How am I going to go from A to B? Because having a car is very, very important. So I really did experience this trauma, that anxiety. I felt traumatized. So I feel that really these laws are very unfair from my point of view as a prescribing. I mean, I used to prescribe, now I'm just teaching, but as a prescribing doctor, clinician, mentor, and a teacher. Also, when we are teaching doctors for our Zoom workshop, which happen on a regular basis, there's always concern and question from the doctors, how do we deal with the laws on driving? And what is wrong, in my opinion, that quite often clinical decisions are based not on the real needs of patients, but on what they prescribe so they can drive. And that law, in my opinion, really has to change, because I believe it's immoral. The law is supposed to protect citizens, and this law is not protecting anyone. It's actually causing a lot of hardship and harm. I guess it was less than 5 minutes.
Oh, no, that was absolutely perfect, as always. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
Thomas.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I thought I would just give you a very quick overview of, I suppose, what the science says around cannabis and driving. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding around, I suppose, the extent to which cannabis does actually affect driving and how it affects it. Now, we generally break down the sort of research I do into experimental and epidemiological research. The experimental research is generally focused on laboratory controlled studies or randomized controlled trials, which are designed to look at essentially how, if you give someone cannabis and then you also give them placebo, to what extent does their performance change, or what level of impairment is there? Now, I've run a couple of studies in this space, one that we ran quite recently in the Netherlands, where we actually took people out driving in traffic on the highway for 100 kilometers at 2 different time points after they had vaporized different kinds of cannabis containing different amounts of THC and CBD. And what we found was that overall, and bear in mind, these were people that were very stoned. These are people that use cannabis every now and again. They're not patients using it medically. They're people with relatively little experience with it. And they were quite intoxicated. The driving never really got any worse than what we would typically see in a driver with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05. And so that was really telling. I think that suggests that the sort of impairment that we're seeing with cannabis is actually quite different from alcohol. While that level of impairment was similar, there was none of the usual patterns of effects that we would typically see with alcohol. People didn't drive more quickly. People were generally reluctant to drive. A few participants actually refused to drive because they were concerned around the risks associated with it. So we sort of saw the opposite. We didn't see that overconfidence that you generally see with alcohol. Instead, we saw a group of people that were reluctant to drive and did so because we were making them as part of a study, but generally would have chosen not to drive in real life if they were in that state. And for those that felt that they were okay to drive, they generally actually were okay to drive. Now, of course, this isn't to say that cannabis is completely benign when it comes to driving. There's cases when it can produce significant impairment, but that's not what we're talking about in this case. We're talking about people using it under prescription in controlled doses over time, and you do begin to develop tolerance. We've seen this now in a number of studies. There's, I suppose, quite a considerable body of evidence showing that people that use cannabis more regularly, that are used to its effects, that are using doses that are not intended to produce significant intoxication, but simply symptom relief, generally don't really show much impairment. There was also another really interesting study conducted in the Netherlands 10 years ago, and this was using 2 different doses of dronabinol, which is a synthetic THC product that's been used quite a while in patients. And they found that neither of the 2 doses they used and in people that use cannabis regularly was sufficient to produce any level of impairment at all. In people that use cannabis very infrequently, they weren't used to it, there was some impairment, but the people that were using it regularly and that were tolerant to its effects, no impairment at all, and less than what you would typically see in a driver with a legal BAC level of 0.05. Turning quickly to the epidemiological evidence, what this does is it looks at how cannabis impacts driving at a population level. So not at the individual, but at the population level. And it's now becoming pretty clear from this research, and this is really mirroring the findings from our experimental research, that your crash risk, if you have any amount of cannabis in your system, is estimated to be somewhere around 1.2 to 1.4. Now, if you have a BAC of 0.05, your crash risk is above 1.5. If you have a BAC of 0.08, it's well above 2 and it increases exponentially above that. If you have antidepressants in your system, your crash risk is actually closer to 2. Opioids, benzodiazepines, significantly worse. So we're sort of seeing a whole lot of emerging evidence now, which suggests that at a population level, cannabis doesn't actually impact crash risk to the same extent that some previous studies may have suggested. Now, at Swinburne at the moment, we've got a couple of studies going on that I think are really relevant to this debate. Both of these are actually, well, in one case, it's funded by Vic Rose. The other one's funded by the Department of Health and Human Services here. And these are really designed to probe some of these questions around cannabis and effects on driving in patients. So we've got one at the moment that's looking at detectability of THC in oral fluid. And without giving too much away, I can tell you that we're seeing wild variability in the results coming back from our roadside drug test that we're doing in the lab. Then we've also got another study that we're running now looking at chronic pain patients. We're tracking them over 3 months once they start using cannabis. We bring them into the lab before they use cannabis for the very first time, and we then track them for 3 months. We bring them in at monthly intervals, and then we can actually quantify effects on driving performance or cognitive performance. We can take blood and saliva samples, and so we can start to probe all these questions that we typically do with the kind of research that we run in our lab. So I think, we have quite a lot of evidence already that's showing us that the extent to which cannabis impacts your driving is heavily dependent on the way in which you use it. And by that, I mean tolerance, the types of THC doses that people are using, and also whether you're using it as a medicine. I mean, as Teresa was saying before, there's quite a lot of evidence that if you're able to reduce your opioid use, for example, other medicines that are known to produce impairment in and of themselves, or provide relief from an underlying condition such as chronic pain, which is also associated with impairment in and of itself, then you may end up with a sort of net neutral effect and potentially even a positive effect on driving. So these are all things that we're looking at in our lab. It's sort of heavy condensing of a lot of research into a couple of minutes, but hopefully that gives you, I suppose, some idea of where we're at and what the current state of science is around cannabis and driving.
Thanks so much, Tom. Always inspiring to hear from you on the actual nuts and bolts research that you're doing. So thank you. And I hope both you and Teresa are looking in the chat there, because Kate Furman is going to snatch you to give evidence when the Upper House inquiry in New South Wales is on as to her bill to change the laws to allow those with who are using medicine to by prescription to be able to drive, the minimalist Tasmania approach. I mean, I think it would be wonderful to have that both of your input in that. And now from the very coalface itself, Fiona.
Thanks so much, David. And thank you so much, Teresa and Thomas. I think you really set out the arguments just so succinctly. And I first acknowledge that we're Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. And thank you, David, for that acknowledgement of country. And I'd just like to pay my respects to elders and particularly the Aboriginal people who are here today. Yes, at the coalface. Well, it seems that I have been banging my head against said coalface for quite some time. And certainly in my time in Parliament since 2014, I have regularly put up amendments to road safety legislation to try and enable medicinal cannabis patients to be treated like any other patient. That said, that if they are using a medicine as prescribed by their doctor and they are not impaired then they should be able to drive. As all of you have succinctly put, that's not the case. In 2019, I put up a bill, the Road Safety Amendment Bill, which really was a very modest approach, and it very much mirrored Tasmania. And effectively, it just said if you have a prescription for cannabis and you were pulled over at a roadside test, and your test positive would be that your prescription would be a defence to a drug driving charge. The government wasn't prepared to support that bill at the time, but they were prepared to allow us to have a task force to consider this. So we had a fairly large task force that included doctors, it included police, it included road safety experts, it included people from TAC, it included people from forensic medicine, included people from a whole range of areas to discuss this. And it became evident fairly early on that the police were not interested in change in Victoria in this circumstance. And Thomas, we presented so much of the evidence and the great work that you and your colleagues have been doing. We presented the evidence of patients. I I spoke about a person I knew who had young man who had epilepsy, and medicinal cannabis, and certainly it was a predominantly CBD product. Once using that, he was seizure free for 2 years, which meant that he could qualify to get his license. And that would have been the first time that this young man who lived in regional Victoria would have had the independence of driving. But because there were possible traces of THC in the medicine that he was taking, he couldn't get a driver's license. And it was heartbreaking hearing that story. So we did the task force. The task force produced a report, which I'm happy to share with people if they're interested in it. It covered the research. It looked at the options of what we could do, similar to what Teresa probably does with patients all of the time, which is have a conversation about the medication that they're using and the side effects of that medication, and advice on whether it's safe to drive or use heavy machinery or work or whatever that might be. The task force could not come to a consensus on the way forward. There was quite a body of work done into a risk tree for prescribers, but we just were very blocked in the mindset of the police that were represented in that task force. And it was really quite disappointing. And it was, the task force sort of finished. I think it was quite a good report, but it didn't come to any form of consensus. Since then, we've continued to advocate, and quite recently, in fact, just last week, we had some patients who were suffering from endometriosis, and they were speaking to the health minister and to other ministers, and without even my prompting, which I normally would have done, they talked about the fact that medicinal cannabis has been an extraordinary medication for treating their pain of endometriosis, but they can only take it when they're on holidays because they have to drive. And so here we have a medication that is providing extraordinary relief, preventing these women from attending the emergency room almost on a monthly basis because of the pain associated with their endometriosis, being denied or not able to take a medication that has provided them with extraordinary relief. The conversation continues, and the legislation, the bill that I introduced in 2019 is still there. I think we have made progress. I think there is greater and greater understanding of medicinal cannabis. I think the work that Thomas has been doing, it has been terrific in demystifying the impacts and effects of cannabis on driving. But again, when we go back to those numbers, we are talking about a very small cohort of people who are using this medicine, using cannabis as a medicine. And I'm hopeful that we may see some progress this year. I'm encouraged. I also understand that the federal body, the Drug Control Advisory Group, I understand that they've also been looking at this issue, and that was discussed at a number of their meetings as well. So I do believe that there's progress. I'm really pleased to see that the New South Wales Upper House is doing this, adding to the work that already has been done. However, I'd have to say Tasmania has shown us, I would say, the evidence that we need, that we haven't seen an escalation in road deaths. We haven't seen an escalation in accidents from medicinal cannabis patients. And I think it's completely preposterous. And, some people start talking conspiracy theories about, the whole range of things. And, it just doesn't make sense that we're not changing these laws. I don't think it makes sense when I speak privately to members of Parliament. But how we turn this corner, whether I can convince, and one of the things that we've been advocating for in Victoria is maybe a trial. So maybe have 100 patients that have been prescribed medicinal cannabis, and they are monitored for a year, and to see if they have had an increased accident rate, or I don't know what we would be monitoring, because I'm fairly certain nothing would happen. However, that's where we are here in Victoria.
Thank you. I noticed Diana's commented that tonight's federal budget includes $58 million to support women suffering from endometriosis, yet there's no mention of cannabis in all of that.
No.
This I think is an Australia-wide issue, that is the pushback from the police. In the state that I live in and in Queensland, there has just been an incredibly active pushback by senior police officers against any changes to these laws. How, without getting into too wild a conspiracy theories, I mean, in New South Wales, we know that they are paid by the road safety budget to administer these tests. So it is a plus for their budget, but I don't think that goes any way to explain it. In totality. Any ideas why this could be?
I'm taking the position that I think the police that I speak to here are incredibly risk averse. So the scenario that they painted during the task force is, what if I pulled someone over, there was a positive test, they showed me their prescription, and they showed me and they told me that they were using it as prescribed, and they went off and killed someone. How would I feel? And I think it's kind of it's a ridiculous scenario, but that is the one that they put forward, and it's quite often it's hard to counter that, except to say that that won't happen. However, I think it is this incredible risk aversion. They also run this argument that, what if a medicinal cannabis patient was to have a prescription, but then use cannabis on a more recreational basis, which again, we're asking adults to be adults. We don't say that about endone, we don't say that about opioids, we don't say that about benzodiazepines, we don't say that about many other substances that we know are used outside their prescription.
Yeah, and we don't say that about mushrooms or LSD, which are completely undetectable as well. Right. So yes, thank you for that.
Going to that quickly,
please.
My sense is that there's also just a lack of correct information. We had a number of Victorian police officers in our lab to come and visit and sort of see the work we're doing a couple of months ago. And I was chatting to them about the work we've been doing, and they were giving me their thoughts about cannabis and driving. And they were sort of coming back to, I suppose, some statistics they had. And I don't know where they got these from, but they just were not up to date. They were reports published by I think maybe Monash or someone in Victoria 20 odd years ago, and they're around crash risk associated with having any amount of cannabis in your system. And first of all, the numbers they had were wrong. They don't really reflect what we now know. But they also said a number of times that we were told that medical cannabis wouldn't show up in a drug test, in a roadside drug test, which represents a fundamental misunderstanding of cannabis as a plant and THC. And so it sort of gave me a new perspective on it, that they just information they had and that they thought, that they were sort of acting probably in good intentions on was actually incorrect. And I have absolutely no idea how you go about changing that. But that gave me, I suppose, a slightly more nuanced perspective on it. It's just some information they had was not actually correct, and it's just out of date.
Yeah.
Teresa, I think you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of these views might be due to the 80 years of prohibition and the policy of dogma, emotion, and fear and stuff like that. And as I said, a lot of them simply don't understand it. Also, when it comes to patients they're taking medicinal cannabis in small doses, As I mentioned before, quite often we are observing that they are more alert, but they tend to be more cautious than, for example, people under alcohol. They tend to drive slower and take precautions. And I believe that most of the accidents they might cause could be in a car parking where they may just hit the car while reversing or anything like that, nothing really fatal. And I also want to comment on New Zealand, because we are teaching doctors in New Zealand as well for our online workshops. And I am a little bit envious of them because, first of all, they only need to write a script for medicinal cannabis, so now they don't need to apply to Ministry of Health, so it's much easier for them. And they can use cannabis as a first-line option if they choose, not like it is here in Australia. So patients don't have to go on trial on all of these opioids and everything before they can receive cannabis. But when it comes to driving, the advice doctors are giving patients is don't drive if you are impaired, especially in the beginning of your titration, when we are working out what medicinal cannabis doses will be effective on you. But once you are okay, you can drive with any amount of THC. However, if you are stopped by the police, then they do the impairment test first, which is very simple, touch your nose or heel to toe walking. And if they fail this test, then they have a blood test. And if they found any amount of THC, they might be penalized. So I think, our neighbors are, I think, much more reasonable here, and they are doing much better than us. And they have similar jurisdictions. So why can't we adopt similar laws?
Thank you for that input. And yes, their Prime Minister says it all, really, doesn't she? Except, yes. So let's hear from Mick Palmer, shall we? B, could we pretend that he's here, and let's make out that I say to him, Mick, tell us what your experience is.
Mick, to what extent is this really about prohibition, as opposed to having anything to do with road safety?
Well, I think it's underpinned by the fact of prohibition and our obsession with the current tough on drugs policy, if you like. I think it is driven by road safety. I mean, we do have a bad road safety record in this country. We lose a lot of people on the roads in circumstances in which they shouldn't die, and there's a reason why people are very concerned about that. And so I understand that they'd want to be tough on any threat of further impairment to our driving skills on the road. I think that's the basic thinking behind it, and I do think that's what drives police more than just the prohibition policy. But certainly, even at the police and certainly the government level, prohibition gets in our way all the time in terms of it trying to make any sort of inroads into the current state of play. No matter how many facts you're able to table and how much evidence you can provide of the fact that what we've now got is badly broken and isn't achieving any of the results that we set for ourselves, not achieving any of the outcomes that we really laid down. And is not minimising harm in any sense at all. And here's a classic example in terms of medicinal cannabis, where it's, of course, aggravating harms, as Fiona just said, in so many ways. I think it's driven by the fear and by the fear of being seen in any sense going weak on a road death problem that is serious, and a road toll problem that's a very serious one, without people being prepared to dig even 1 inch below the surface to look at the sort of issues that certainly Tom and Teresa have talked about now, and the reality of what we all know, that the taking of the drug, there is no sign of impairment in almost all of the apprehensions that occur. It is simply the fact of the presence of a drug that is leading to the person securing a criminal conviction. To anybody who takes any time looking at that, that doesn't make much sense. But I think, as Tom said, I think until we can come up with a test that gives people some confidence, and I think it sounds like we're getting a long way down that track, which I think is very important, that we can assess, no matter whether I have a prescription or not, we can assess to some extent the reality of my impairment. Probably we're going to have some difficulty in changing the law at the moment. It's what Fiona said about the police attitude. If they let them go, they have a crash down the road, how am I going to feel? I mean, that tends to be how police officers think, and I can give you 1,000 reasons in terms of how many times we do that, and a crime takes place down the road and we don't stop exercising discretion. Of course, you can't be sure of the outcome of any discretion you exercise, and so the argument, in a sense, is really a silly one, but it's not. If you're not, at the same time, it's a concerned one. They are worried about that. That's driving their thinking. With a test like Tom has outlined and Teresa has touched on, I think that would give people a lot more comfort and confidence to move forward. At the moment, I think it's a case of it's illegal, therefore you can't do it. I mean, that's where prohibition, I think, is the underpinning problem here, David. This drug is an illegal drug, therefore you shouldn't have it in your system, so therefore you can't drive.
That was amazing work, David, to have Teresa, me and Tom in the video.
It was incredible. I don't know who the old man with the beard was. That was the one I couldn't work out. Tom, just on that topic, if we had a rule or a law that said that you weren't to use within, say, 6 hours of taking your medicinal cannabis, would that allay any fears of impairment?
Look, if impairment is going to take place, generally with inhaled routes of administration, so mainly with vaporized cannabis, you see that impairment will last somewhere around 3 to 4 hours, maybe a little bit longer in some cases. With orally administered oils, it may be up to around 8 hours. So it could exceed a 6-hour window. I think cases where that's likely to occur are probably going to be very limited in number. I mean, as Teresa was saying just before, there's all this sort of standard precautions that you would go through, that any doctor would go through with their patient with any drug that could impair their driving, around not driving at first, and while you're figuring out the THC dose and slowly titrating upwards, just avoid driving for a period of time until the patient's stable and they're familiar with its effects, and the doctor's sure that the patient's functioning isn't really being impacted by it. But in terms of I don't want to put a number on it, because it's very difficult to say that everyone's going to be okay to drive or do any kind of safety sensitive task after X amount of time. It's very hard to do, and I sort of worry that that's going to get misconstrued. And there are cases in which someone could conceivably be impaired for longer than 6 hours, but in most cases, it's very unlikely.
Are we going to get a test for impairment beyond touching nose and heel toe in the near future?
Well, we're working on it, I think, and I suppose that's what the video is referencing. We've spoken about this before, and we are getting close. There's a few app-based cognitive tests that are designed to run within a couple of minutes, and they give you some indication of whether someone's actually functionally impaired, not just do they have something in their system, but is their performance negatively affected. The problem is you're comparing that person to their own baseline. You have to know what that person's performance is normally. And you can have normative data. You can go for a 55-year-old woman with a college education. She's likely to be around this. But, I'm not sure that that's really going to translate into effective, accurate roadside policy. But we're getting closer. I mean, there is evidence these apps are quite effective, at least in our trial settings. They reduce the time we would normally be doing cognitive testing for down to a couple of minutes. So we do seem to be getting relatively accurate readouts, and I think that gets us close. There's also people looking at cannabis breathalyzers. My concern is that those are also essentially coming back to just tests of presence.
That's right.
But people are, I suppose, exploring. There's a lot of work going on, and quite a number of startups that are looking at ways to get around this, because it's not just an issue here in Australia. Nowhere else has quite the same roadside drug testing laws, but certainly the issue of driving in medical cannabis patients is probably even a bigger issue in some ways in the US and Canada, where those industries are far more mature.
I think it's also really important to remember that we're not having these conversations about opioids, benzodiazepines, and antidepressants. We're not talking about, are we testing for that? I posed to the police commissioner here. I said, well, why don't you just actually charge people with use of cannabis instead of, because you're not charging someone with driving under the influence. You're not charging someone with driving with impairment. You're charging someone with driving with the presence of a substance. And they really balked at that. Oh no, we'd never want to charge anyone, that would be an indictable offence. And that's exactly what they're doing. And I think in New South Wales in particular, that is exactly what they're doing. They are trying to charge people basically for using cannabis, not for being impaired, not for being reckless, not for putting other people at risk, but purely because they've used cannabis. And and we have a serious offence for that. And I almost wanted to push them that way to see if we could get them to back off, because they all attest that they do not want to be charging people for use and possession of drugs. They want to treat drug use as a health issue, but here is a perfect example where they don't.
And I guess we've got the situation in the ACT where you can grow, where cannabis possession and use has been decriminalised to a significant extent, yet you still can't drive after you use it. Sorry, Teresa, please.
No problem. I just want to also refer to Thomas, the comment. In my personal opinion, I think it would be a bit difficult to establish with a time frame when everyone can drive, because too many variabilities. THC is fat soluble. Medicinal cannabis patients take it on a regular basis. I will assume that it will accumulate in a fat tissue. There are also slow and fast metabolizers. Some people are perfectly okay just with one dose at night. Some people may require 3 or 4 times per day. So different rates of metabolism, different formulations, fat solubility, accumulation in the system. So I think it's a little bit different than when alcohol, correct me if I am wrong, but this is my personal opinion.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah,
are there any questions?
Standardize it, like for example, alcohol, that amount corresponds to that.
Yes, and I guess with alcohol, the standardisation isn't real, because, of course, some people who drink build up a tolerance and they're not nearly as effective. I don't drink at all. If I were to have one drink, I'd be under 0.05, but I would not be safe to drive. So, yeah, it's all good. Now, I would like to ask Fiona, at least in New South Wales, one of the problems is, dare I say it, the Labor Party, which one would expect to be progressive, or at least more progressive in this area. Of course, we have had support from some National Party members federally who have spoken in Parliament in support of changing the drug laws. So I don't want to say this is a left-right divide, but what is the bar for what would normally be a progressive party to making this change?
I don't think it is a left-right divide, although no one wants to be wedged on this. No one wants to be wedged. So both parties, there's very little sunlight between both parties' policies on this. When I recently put up a bill around the decriminalisation of use and possession of drugs in Parliament a few weeks ago, both sides of Parliament argued about decriminalisation would lead to people driving unsafely. There is no evidence for that, but they both use that argument. So I don't think there's a political divide on this. I have to say, though, when I speak to most MPs privately about this, off the record about this, they are far more relaxed. All of them, these days, everyone knows someone who has a medicinal cannabis prescription. Now, some of them are at late stage, motor neuron disease or a cancer, and they're not driving anyway. But for many, they know someone who is using medicinal cannabis and is getting great relief out of it. And so they understand that. They understand the issues. I feel like no one is having the political, will to change this, and it's incredibly frustrating. And which is why I almost want to push them, going, all right, arrest those medicinal cannabis patients, because they're in possession of a substance. Yes, I know they've got a prescription for it. However, you are effectively cancelling their license because of the use of a medication.
Sure, thank you. Look, our hour is nearly up. I suppose the next 5 minutes or so, I'd like to hear from each of the panellists as to what we can do to best, what you think the best tactic is, the best way forward to change these laws. Obviously, I'm involved with Drive Change, and it's multifaceted, and we're getting industry on board. And I think some of the comments I've been reading, the unions are probably an area where we've not focused enough attention, because it is their members often who are going to be suffering the inability to drive buses or deliver mail or work in schools for that matter and drive there. But if there's things that we can do and do differently, or unique ways of changing these laws, let's hear it. Teresa, any ideas?
I think we have to have a bigger voice. We need to be heard as much as possible. Maybe individually, everyone involved, maybe start talking to their local MPs, write letters, petitions. Fiona is already currently having a petition. Let's just get involved, maybe, speak on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and so on, and just raise our concerns and be noisy and talk about it as much as possible. We need to be heard.
Sure. Thank you. Tom?
I probably need Fiona to tell me, but I think, in terms of what I can do, to me, it's around education and knowledge and giving people, I suppose, the tools to make sensible decisions. And, we're trying to do that now with a couple of these studies that I mentioned before. We're collecting real-world evidence from patients. These are studies funded by government, so that gives me some hope, I suppose, that people are invested in actually seeing, does medical cannabis actually do anything? And are people okay to drive? And the answer is probably going to be okay, but actually collecting that sort of hard evidence to back that up. So that's from my point of view, that's what I'm able to do. And hopefully, that goes somewhere to changing things.
Thank you, Tom. Fiona?
Tom, I would like you, I think your conversations with police are so important. And I don't know whether there's a way to get into some of those law enforcement conferences, those conferences that are attended by police, because having that data and having that information put in front of them, that education is incredibly helpful. It's also really helpful for MPs like myself. But as Teresa said, those personal stories, we know that here in Victoria, the Premier Andrews was we were the first state to legalise medicinal cannabis. And that was because of a young boy with intractable epilepsy. And when the Premier spoke to that family, that was what got him over the line. So I think MPs need to hear from their constituents. I think they need to hear those personal stories. So Teresa, whenever you're educating doctors, if doctors can also, if you can encourage them to speak to their local MPs and tell the stories of their patients or tell the stories of why they are prescribing. But I think it's really, I don't know how many people have got a prescription for medicinal cannabis as opposed to those that use cannabis medicinally, that those that with a prescription, if all of them were to contact local MPs, I think that would have a significant impact. And we probably need the help of our prescribing doctors to engage them in that campaign.
That's right, I agree. But also, I just have a crazy idea in that moment right now. Perhaps we could run a series of webinars for policemen, for policymakers. Just give them the basic information 1 hour about endocannabinoid system, about receptors in the human body, how cannabis interacts, what are the mechanisms of actions, how it works. Just very simple, 1 hour webinar, just to explain the very basic science behind cannabis. Perhaps that would give them a little bit of insight into that. I just had this idea right now. Education webinars for police, because I'm not sure how much they know about endocannabinoid system deficiency, receptors in our body, endocannabinoids, and so on. Perhaps we could enlighten them a little bit. Not even talking about driving laws, just explain how cannabis works in the human body.
Thank you.
And I love getting in touch with the unions. I think the unions could be really powerful in this. We're dealing with some TAC, the transport accident and workers' compensation claims at the moment, as I know, drive changes, and unions should be involved in those.
And of course, we need the MPs to get the police on board and to get them in, and we're happy to run the webinars, and it's how we get to that audience. And of course, in an ideal world, police should not be making policy; they should be following policy. And I get the feeling that the police on the ground are on side. That's certainly my experience, and I think Fiona's as well. The police on the ground don't like these laws any more than we do. I suppose one thing on our side is the numbers, and that is the numbers of those who are using medicinal cannabis are ever growing, and the numbers of those who are going to start coming before the courts. But I do think the power of the individual story is really important. In Victoria, you had the young boy. In New South Wales, we had Lucy Haslam and her son. Those are the stories, the 60 minutes run, that really make the difference. But hopefully, seminars like this, roundtables like this are part of it. And I would very much like to thank Fiona, Teresa, and Tom. I'd also like to thank the Drive Change crew, Matt, Gino, Tom, myself, and of course the wonderful organiser of this, B, for their help, and all the people who've come and put their comments down that we'll dutifully go through, and some good information and interest has come out of that. So look, we wanted to do it in an hour. We've done it in an hour, and a short meeting's a good meeting. So thank you very much for your attendance. And by the time we meet again, I'm sure a couple of states will have fallen our way. So thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you.